We all use the term modern almost casually. We think we are modern. Modernity is generally contrasted with tradition. One is either modern or traditional. Most of us, when asked whether you are modern or traditional, will most likely prefer to identify oneself as modern. But what does either being modern or traditional mean? We assume that the meaning of these terms are so self-evident that they need not be questioned or even be explained. Being modern would then be assumed to mean being contemporary, up to date, and in tune and in harmony with the world around us, in both thought and action. Tradition under such terms then would be placed outside and prior to the onset of a phase or a period we vaguely refer to as modern or contemporary. This implies that there is a temporal dimension to this position, and that there must exist a time or a period, however vaguely defined, when we can locate the transition from tradition to modernity. In other words, when did we become modern? And if we can identify and articulate the differences and similarities in terms of thought and action between the two before and after this time period, we might be able to arrive at some understanding of what they mean. But the history or the etymology of the word modern offers an interesting reading. In Europe, the term modern seems to appear every time. There is a sense of something new in the air. In that sense, it was less of a self-conscious assertion of the new era, still not yet completely alienated from the past. Past was necessary condition for it to exist. It defined itself against it. For want of a better term, we may refer to it as organic modernity, where the word modern was more an adjective to describe something else than the noun, a phenomena in its own right. Such modernity, in fact, is a common and necessary condition in every society, whereby norms evolve gradually in response to changing circumstances. And when mankind desires to be contemporaneous with the time we live in, people become modern without consciously thinking about being modern. A far more radical consciousness of modernity, at least in architecture, can be traced to the 1683 publication of the French architect and theorist Charles Perrault's book titled Ordonnance in Paris. This study of 5 orders of Greek architecture was the first serious analytical study of the fundamental grammar of the classical language. This was arguably the most important landmark and can be called the birth of the self-conscious modernity. Self-conscious because, unlike organic modernity, where being modern implied continuously upgrading traditional past practices to make them contemporaneous without thinking about being modern, here in this case, being modern implied a conscious break from the past in order to identify the new as distinct from the old. Until this time, adhering to the classical language of Greek orders was almost mandatory requirement for architects. The conventional belief was that these five orders were divinely ordained and are immutable. Perrault, on the other hand, showed that these orders have been arrived at through a long process of codification and systemization of the artisanal practices and not divinely ordained. In other words, Perrault demystified the classical architecture and liberated the profession from the constraining practices which had already begun to lose its contemporary validities. In the 18th century, this gave rise to several public buildings in France, which display a rebellion against classical architecture, and the term modern became an adjective, a label to identify the new style that was emerging as opposition to the classical past. The theory advanced by Charles Perrault that cultural customs determine the appropriateness of architectural choices and not any immutable laws of classical architecture was the basis for the 1980s publication of the noted architectural historian Joseph Rickworth, The First Moderns. Rickworth has argued that this gave architects of the 18th century a sense of authorship of their work and a rationale for the break from the past. It was a self-conscious assertion of a new era. The idea of modernity thus became intricately connected with the European avant-garde, art and architecture, and heralded the emergence of architecture as an independent profession. It wasn't until that time. In fact, Charles Perrault himself was also a medical doctor by qualification, practicing architecture as a hobby. But here we need to step back and take a broader view to put this in a larger context. Thus, we have two distinct ideas of modernity. One, the organic modernity, which is a continuously ongoing process of staying up to date with a contemporary intellectual and technological milieu, and which has built civilization throughout history. The state of modernity in this case is relative to the intellectual and technological developments of any society and has no date for its beginning or its end. The second idea of modernity, as we saw above, is an exclusively European notion of a conscious break from the past. In that sense, Perrault's demystification of the revered classical orders is similar to Galileo's invention of telescope. In both cases, past beliefs and traditions were revealed to be obstacles for new rational knowledge system and had to be removed for the new era to come about. This new era was named modern in radical opposition to the traditions. So what was the past that this modernity replaced? In medieval Europe, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, all knowledge was controlled by traditions and enforced by the church. The aim of modernity then was to overcome this tyranny of religion and metaphysics by restructuring all knowledge into three autonomous fields: science, concerning the external world around us and the laws of nature; humanities, concerning all interpersonal matters, including jurisprudence and politics, how people relate with each other, sociology; language, philosophy, history; and third, art, expression. Each of these domains of culture could now correspond to cultural professions in which problems could be dealt with as the concern of spatial expert, such as scientists, economists, and artist architects, who can explore this intrinsic structure of the respective sphere through logic and rationality. Max Weber, the 19th century sociologist, has characterized this as cultural modernity and has linked it with the rise of rationalism. It is in this self-consciousness that the term modern became an adjective to be applied to a society or an individual. Either a society is modern or an individual is modern or traditional. It implied rationality, individuation, and a particular relationship with the past. It is in this context that the recognition of the independent profession of architecture should be understood. The professional architect now came to be regarded as more adept at being logical in matters concerning architecture than the others. The professional architect came to be regarded as more adept at being logical in matters concerning architecture than others. It was these developments which were epochal enough for Joseph Rickword to declare architects of the 18th century as the first moderns. But the modernity he was referring to was the self-conscious modernity. But let us pause here for a moment and view the above narrative in a historical perspective. We can see distinct patterns that Europe in particular and the Western civilization in general has constructed to claim exclusive ownership of this modernity. I intend to show that modernity was neither born in the 18th century Europe, nor was it exclusively an European innovation. This is possible if we examine the markers of self-conscious modernity, the distinct characteristics that distinguish modern from the pre-modern society. I've been able to identify three such markers: rationality, individuation or the rise of the individualism, and a particular relationship with the past. Two of these markers, rationality and individuation, are shared by both ideas of modernity, the organic modernity and the self-conscious modernity, while the third, relationship with the past, distinguishes the self-conscious modernity from the organic modernity. Europe has a long intellectual history that believes that rationalism and scientific temper are of European origin. Consider this quote from one of the finest philosophers of our time, Paul Ricoeur. I quote, "We have to keep in mind that if science is Greek in its origin and European through Galileo, Descartes, Newton, etc., science does not foster this power of unifying mankind because it is Greek or European, but because it's a human dimension," unquote. Ricoeur does acknowledge that science, and by extension reason, is a human dimension to be found in the whole of humanity. It's clear, though, that its origin lies in Greece and is essentially European. But Ricoeur is not alone. This sentiment is deeply rooted in the entire European scientific and general intellectual tradition. A powerful counter argument is made by an equally fine philosopher, Jitendranath Mohanty. I quote here, if philosophy is the highest and purest form of rational inquiry, is it at all permissible to speak of European rationality? Does not an adjective such as European impose a limitation which destroys the very essence of rationality? It is therefore possible to speak of an overarching sense of rationality and so of philosophy, which will contain within it internal differentiations such as Indian darshanas and Greek philosophia, unquote. In other words, rationality being a universal attribute of mankind has taken multiple forms in different civilizations. To call it European is inherently contradictory to the very essence of rationality. We shall see architectural manifestation of this shortly. While individuation, the rise of the autonomized individual as a societal phenomena, can be attributed to the 18th century, the issue is far more complex. It has to do with how decisions are made in the society. In the pre-modern societies, decisions about what is significant and the norms that should govern the social life of all were arrived at by a long process of consensus building about shared values and beliefs, which we call traditions. These traditions continue to guide people in their private as well as public life for a very, very long time, so long as the decisions retain their significance. Changes did occur, but in an imperceptibly slow pace. People went on doing what they were doing because it has always been done that way. Traditions decided what is the right thing to do for everyone. An individual had very little role in this process. But it will be wrong to think that a unique and autonomous individual did not exist or had no role to play. It is indeed true that throughout history, uniquely endowed individuals have, with their alternative vision, changed the course of history. Abrahams, Gautam Buddha, Karl Marx, and Gandhi, to name just the obvious. And the change they have effected were also in the nature of modernity, relative to what they have changed, the past, the established traditions. These individuals are also modern, and such instances also exist in the field of architecture, as we are about to see shortly. Thus, to call architects of the 18th century as the first moderns would not only be constricted view of history of architecture, but also betrays the subtle movement to turn modern, the adjective, into modernism, a noun, and claim exclusive ownership by the Western civilization. The third marker of modernity, relationship with the past, is equally complex and is the one where past in general and history in particular are not viewed similarly by the organic modernity and the self-conscious modernity. Our conventional sense of modernity, which we have uncritically adopted from the European idea of modernity, is founded on the notion of time moving in a single direction from past to present into the future, and where past is not retrievable, You cannot go back to the past. Thus, being modern implies a complete negation of the past. For example, in the initial years, Bauhaus rejected teaching of history as counterproductive to modern design. Traditions and modernity then constitutes a binary of adversaries. If you're traditional, you are not modern. And if you're modern, you are not traditional. But such stark opposition between the past and present is not found in other civilizations, and also in the pre-modern Europe. In India, for example, we have a word for tradition, parampara. The etymology of this word makes an interesting point. It is made up of two root words, param and para. The former, param, connotes a superlative status, as in param pujya, the most revered, or paramvir, the strongest and the bravest. The latter para implies the other, as in paradesha, the other country, or parastri, the other man's woman. In temporal terms, in historical terms, it would mean the other time or that which has gone. Thus, parampara would mean past which is to be revered, preserved, and remembered. But not all past is accorded this status. There is another word, junvani, meaning the old talk, implying that which has lost its significance and can be discarded. Thus, far from discarding the past, it is often brought in to interrogate the efficacies of the new, and at the same time, the past is also reinterpreted in light of the people's desire to be contemporaneous. The past gets contained in the present. All these three markers of modernity, rationality, individuation, and relationship with history, have resulted in interesting architectural manifestations. If we apply this as criteria for modernity, we find that green shoots of modernity were already springing up in other parts of the world, even in Europe, much before the 18th century. Let us look at some of them. I have chosen the Basilica of St. Andrea in Mantua by Alberti as the first example, as it shows all the three markers of modernity, 3 centuries before Rickard's claim of the first moderns in the 18th century. St. Andrea shows clear innovations in both plan form as well as in the composition of the corporeal body elements. Until this time, Christian churches had centralized plan form, as shown in this diagrammatic representations. Altars were in the center, surrounded by worshippers on all sides. By mid-15th century, though, the Christian liturgy had begun to include a procession of pilgrims coming to the altar. And for this, centralized plans were unsuitable and a new configuration was needed. Alberti's proposal is remarkable in that while rejecting the immediate Christian plans, centralized forms, he harvested the new by reinterpreting the pre-Christian temples of Solomon and the Basilica of Maxentius. Both these examples had a central long nave with buttressed side layers. Alberti's initial plan shows a clever combination of both these partial forms. The past is brought in to the present to substantiate the new present. Similarly, the facade of the new basilica brings together the ancient Greek temple facade, consisting of columns, entablature, and pediment, but now with an interesting integration of the Roman triumphant arch in the center. St. Andrea's huge central space and the buttressing side chapels strongly resemble the layout of the ancient Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine in the Roman Forum. The basilica plan is perfectly suited to large churches, since it could accommodate massive crowds. But unlike immediately earlier basilica plan churches, St. Andrea's plan seems to return more strictly to the ancient forms. The design of the Basilica of St. Andrea is attributed to Alberti. This is one of the earliest examples of such attribution, as the earlier tradition dictated that the bishop who commissioned the church would be so attributed as the author. This recognition of Alberti as the author of this great building is also the earliest example of rationality and individuation. This suggests that rational innovations initiated by autonomous individual minds heralding the modernity in Europe happened 3 centuries prior to what we conventionally believe it to be. It has not only altered the plan form of Christian churches from centralized to the cross plan, but also has given us one of the finest spaces in early Renaissance. But a more relevant point is that this phenomenon is not limited to Europe only. In the 15th century, the Turkish architect Sinan Aga emerged with a large body of work attributed to his authorship in the Ottoman Empire. And Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar in the 16th century, the third Mughal emperor of India, a versatile individual, built the royal citadel of city of Fatehpur Sikri, 35 kilometers from Agra. Though in case of both Sinan and Akbar, the relationship between the precedent and innovation had to be negotiated very differently than in the case of their European counterparts, like Alberti. The experimentation they both brought to their architecture betrays a similar modernist sensitivity that go beyond both stylistic or formal concerns. Sylvania Mosque in Istanbul, attributed to Sinan, is a case in point. Sinan, of course, had to contend with the powerful precedent of Hagia Sophia, originally built in the Roman era as a basilica. In this mosque, which he clearly intended to challenge and surpass the precedent, he pushed the boundaries of structure, space, and light by transforming the Hagia Sophia's long nave into a gigantic baldachin-like centralized square dome space full of natural light. This is done by skillfully reinterpreting the aisles, apse, and the narthex of the former Hagia Sophia as a continuous layer surrounding the central dome space. This abstract rationality of the plan form is complemented by a series of corporeal decisions, such as the slender minarets with 2 pairs of variable heights, which define, in this case, the forecourt and not the main mosque as usually expected. The red carpeted floor common to the central square space, extended as well to the outer layer, and the continuously running gallery at the spring point of the arches, demarcating and modulating the verticality, also serve as a counterpoint to the two-layered structure, abstract and obvious only in the plan form. And of course, the quality of light makes the difference. Clearly, for Sinan, architecture of this grand mosque emerged from multiple sources and precedents. Still, all these precedents have been reinterpreted in light of his then present. Though its layout was clearly modeled on the precedent of Hagia Sophia's plan, the plan form has been purposefully reworked to meet the new demands of the present, while at the same time to evoke the collective memories of the past. Sylvania Mosque is a fusion of Christian and Islamic symbolism, and in doing so, transcends the hegemony of any one religion, makes it undoubtedly modern. Sinan's mosque was undoubtedly, undeniably, a modern building in its time, but without discarding history. Prior to the emergence of Sinan as the undisputed genius with right to individual authorship, the settled tradition in the Ottoman court was for a centralized corps of royal architects to collectively carry out and execute all important projects with shared authorship. Design resolution thus had to be arrived at according to the established practices, and the chief architect, Mimar in Persian language, was only the first among equals. It is the institution that claimed the credit and not the individual. It also reflects the fact that established ways of arriving at any decisions in traditional societies is through long-standing collective agreements and not the consequence of individual will. With his emergence as a genius, Sinan must have had to contend with inevitable tension that must have ensued between the supremacy of the institution and the radiance of his individual will. The successful resolution of this tension in favor of the individual marks the onset of modernity, as the uniqueness of the individual is one of the fundamental tenets of modernity. Seen in this historic context, Sinan emerges as the catalyzer of an emergent will and aspiration of people for modernity. If Sinan was the catalyzer of the general will, Akbar was capable of shaping that will. He, after all, was the emperor. Historically, Mughals were great builders and have left behind a rich legacy of palaces, mausoleums, civic buildings, and gardens in India. Still, the citadel of Fatehpur Sikri is unique in that this is the first such large urban complex built by the Mughals. Even though his official chroniclers maintain scrupulous records of his reign, there is no historical records to suggest that any institutionalized structure within the court similar to Ottoman existed to carry out a royal construction. What we do know, though, is that Akbar, after his conquest of the provinces of Gujarat and Rajasthan in the Western India, brought from there an army of skilled craftsmen, masons and stone cutters to build his citadel. We also know from the accounts of a Portuguese friar, Father Montserrat, who tutored the royal children, that the emperor took keen personal interest in the construction and often visited the workshop to supervise the work. There is also an excellent illustration in Akbarnama, the official chronicle of Akbar's reign, showing the emperor inspecting the construction of Fatehpur Sikri. I'm going to stick my neck out and attribute the authorship of the architectural decisions to Akbar as the architect of Fatehpur Sikri. Fatehpur Sikri also seems to be Akbar's architectural laboratory. Within this citadel, we find several buildings which have no precedents, no references in the traditions, which had so far provided men with answers to their myriad design problems. Traditions, as we have noted before, means the received wisdom wherein a society has evolved a set of rules and guidelines for best practices and passed on from generation to generation. Changes, improvements, and improvisations do occur, but slowly and imperceptibly. Innovations and radical departures from this set path is not the norms. Decisions taken by an architect will reflect the collective will and memories more than his own rational faculty. But at Fatehpur Sikri, we find that the elements of innovation in these buildings far outweigh reliance on traditional wisdom. Take, for example, Queen Mother Mariam Makani's palace, erroneously named, I believe, as Raja Birbal's palace. Its pinwheel plan, both symmetrical and asymmetrical at the same time, and the absence of Iwan, the portico or veranda, an element mandated by tradition as a spatial layer to counter the climate, is too radical a departure from tradition to be explained away as improvisation. It has resulted in a most unusual three-dimensional formal resolution. While its architectonic details, such as the brackets, the chhajjas, jarukhas, and the mathematical ratios and geometric precision of the surface articulations, can be attributed to traditional skills of the craftsmen Akbar had brought from Gujarat and Rajasthan, its asymmetrical and dynamic distribution of mass and the coexistence of pitched and circular domes point to a human desire to test the limits of this tradition. Another building, popularly known as Diwan-e-Khas, has no precedent whatsoever in the way elements are brought together. Explanations based on utilitarian functionalist criteria, such as the emperor's place of meeting with selected councillors, have not been convincing. Why, for example, make a beautiful room of exquisite architectural qualities in itself, and then bring a massive mushroom column placed right in the center, connected to the corners with bridges, rendering the room practically unusable as a meeting place in any conventional sense? In my book on Fatehpur Sikri, The Embodied Vision, I have speculated and have come to the conclusion that this building had a symbolic meaning and cannot be explained away through utilitarian functional criteria. To that extent, it was an innovation, a clear departure from traditions. Apart from design of these buildings, standardization of dimension and prefabrication of elements in many a building show clear rationalization of technology and construction practice, which too has no precedent. The Portuguese friar, Father Montserrat, has noted that Akbar had built a workshop at a distance to fabricate building elements so as not to be disturbed by the noise. Whatever may be the rationale for the decision, it entails conceiving of construction process in a radically different way and involving unmistakable rationalization. This is a radical departure from the on-site carving and fabrication of stone elements, which was, and in some cases still is, the standard practice for temple construction. Even though it has not been specifically mentioned anywhere, it is fair to assume that Akbar was more than just the benevolent patron of Fatehpur Sikri. He was directly involved in the design and construction of the city. Could it be then that these decisions were intuitively arrived at by Akbar, but not articulated enough for them to be recorded? Akbar was known to be illiterate. He did not read or write and dictated his orders and reports to his official chroniclers. Can Fatehpur Sikri then be the threshold between architectural wisdom evolved over centuries and perfected unconsciously by cultural traditions on one hand, and the rational and willful act of a man conscious of his own intentions on the other? Can Fatehpur Sikri and Sylvania Mosque be the telltale sign of the beginning of the age of reason in India and in Turkey? Could this be the tentative beginning of the emergence of architect as the author? It's an intriguing possibility. The history of non-Western architecture has always been structured by the Western historians around religious fault lines. It's either Hindu architecture or Islamic architecture or Buddhist architecture or Jain architecture. It has always been within these broad parameters that formal developments have been validated by the respective belief systems, as much as structural determinism, like technological advancement. Sinan's work too is subsumed within the larger narrative of Islamic architecture. But even this historiography is an Orientalist narrative. Secularization of history is long overdue, if and when undertaken. One of the questions historians may ask is how were the decisions taken and from where did the choices emerge? I suspect we may see increasing frequency of human reason and individual will showing up in the non-Western world too, across religious divisions from 17th century onward. For example, the plan of the city of Jaipur, credited to Vidyadhar Bhattacharya, had departed significantly from the traditional Prastara plan form. And the Hawa Mahal, credited to the architect Lal Chand Ustad, is an unconventional and non-traditional conception of a palace. And of course, there is Jantar Mantar, the observatory designed by Maharaja Jai Singh, a scientist himself. You cannot find a better example of science and rationality integrated with architecture. These buildings were unquestionably modern in their own time. Organic modernity already existed long before the arrival of the self-conscious modernity, with colonization